So a little change of pace today. We're not going to work on my Land Cruiser because I'm waiting on parts. We're not going to work on my E36 M3 because we're waiting on parts. So I have to work on something, right? So I'm going to work on my E36. This is my Aegean Blue 97328. It has an S52 and front and rear subframes out of an E36 M3. It's pretty much an M3 now. It's the 328. But when I built the car, I overlooked a few things, and I put a 338 final drive in, and it just turns too many RPM going down the highway for my likings. I also did not replace the differential bushing, which was pretty dumb. It's very bad, so it's time to do that. And we're going to address a kind of soft clutch pedal. This car's been sitting in my basement for 2 or more years. I guess I have too many projects or car. No, that can't be it. So anyway, I'm going to show you how to swap a differential in an E36, and I'll fix a clutch pedal issue hopefully, and we'll go from there. So the first thing we want to do is drain the fluid. Obviously you can pull this out without draining the fluid because the axles unbolt from these axle stubs, but I like to drain the fluid that way. Something happens, there's no fluid on the floor or less fluid on the floor, and to do that it's a 14mm Allen, and I have this socket here, and what I do is, since when you slide this in the drain, it's kind of the spare tire wheel is kind of in the way. So what I do is I slide that 14mm Allen through a 14mm wrench so that I can turn it like so. I'm just gonna get fluid out, hopefully not make a mess in the process. Just a little mess. So while that's draining, we're gonna go ahead and disconnect the vehicle speed sensor. You just squeeze the 2 tabs together. Easier said than done. And then there's a metal clip that holds that wire, which I'll probably have to pry off, to the rear differential housing. There we go. Cool, that went in the fluid. Now the next thing that we're going to do is take the axle bolts out. Now before I get into what it takes to get those out, what I do to hold the rear axles from turning, because you're going to be trying to loosen these, and these are pretty tight. Instead of putting the parking brake on or putting it in gear and having to go into the car and get out of the car and go back and forth, I take a screwdriver, and there's a gap between the caliper and the carrier for the caliper, and I slide it into the rotor, and that locks it from turning either direction. And then if you need at that point to turn it, you just pull this out and rotate it. Now this car is limited slip like all M3s do. If a car has an open differential, you'll need one of these on both sides. Again, this is just really easy. It just saves you from having to go up and down. So to get the axle bolts out, these are an E12. So I have this socket that's kind of, it's got a long shank on it, and it works nice to get around the inside CV boot. And these things typically get coated with a bunch of junk on them. So what you want to do is take your socket and kind of make sure you wiggle it around and push all of that crap off of there. You can usually also use a brush and just scrape away that stuff. If you can't get the socket all the way down, there's a high chance at stripping these. And when you strip them, then they're a lot of fun to get out. So I always take the socket and wiggle them around on there a whole bunch. I got my screwdriver in there, and then we can start taking these out. All right, so now slide our screwdriver out, and I need something to turn that a little more. I'll stick it in here and get to the next 2. I usually do 2 at a time. When they're on the bottom, they're kind of tough to get to, so I usually leave this at like the 9 o'clock position and 10:30, 11, 12, something like that. I don't know how to read a clock. So before you get the axle bolts out of both sides, or at least all of the axle bolts out, we're going to get the driveshaft nuts loose. They are 16mm, and to keep the driveshaft from spinning, we're not going to hop in the car and put it in gear or put the parking brake on. Instead, we're going to use the same trick we use to keep the axles from rotating. Again, if you have a limited slip, you need 1 screwdriver. I would probably put 2 in it no matter what, because it takes a little more force to get these loose. So now that I've got all the axle bolts, you can kind of wiggle this, and they'll usually come off, and the bolts will stay in. You want to leave the bolts in there, although it's just unnecessary to pull them out. So now we're gonna go on to the other side and get those out. So this side's a little more difficult. You've got your exhaust in the way. It's just one more thing to contend with. I don't like taking the exhaust down for this, as you just risk having a leak, putting it back together, or breaking one of the studs. So we're just gonna work around it. We're gonna use an extension and we'll get them out the same way. All right, so we've got the bolts out of that. Now we can hopefully get this loose. This one will probably take a little bit more effort. Probably have to use a pry bar. Get that axle a little out of that cup. There we go. So now that we've got those nuts loose, we're gonna kind of knock this loose. There's not enough play for the drive shaft to come all the way out of the pinion flange, but we need to get it as far as we can. So we're just gonna kind of do that. Then we're gonna, oh, there goes my screwdrivers. And just make sure it's as loose as we can get it. And it's not stuck. Okay, we're good. Now that the drive shaft and axles are loose, the next step, before we can even start to unbolt the diff from the subframe, is we have to get the most annoying feature of this car, in my opinion. Probably not the most annoying, but the sway bar blocks the bolts that hold the diff to the subframe. So we need to get the sway bar down, and there's a 13 on both sides. It's like a nut and a bolt. It's not a capture nut. I don't know why it's not a capture nut. I also don't know why they couldn't just push this up another inch so you could get right onto the bolts without having to disrupt the sway bar. But, you know, I'm not an engineer. I just try to put cars back together and usually fail. So I've got both side bolts out, and the bottom just kind of slips into the subframe. And so we're just gonna push this up and out of the way. So to keep this out of the way, because now the bolts are out, nothing really keeps it out of the way, I take a screwdriver and I go through the top bolt where the 13 was, stick it through, and then I turn it sideways and put it on the fuel filler neck, and that keeps the sway bar out of the way for these bolts to come out. So to get these bolts out, this side is pretty shallow with the spare tire well. I could use another 1/2 inch here, guys. But anyway, the driver's side comes out pretty easily. You can fit a ratchet and a socket in there. But I use this wrench. This is a double-sided box. This is like a 14, 17, 18, 19 ratchet wrench from AutoZone. The old ones were awesome. They got new ones out that are made by Gear Wrench that kind of suck. But you can put these in here, and they have just enough to grab that bolt. And we can get them out just by doing this. I'm going to do that on the other side so we can get these out next. So I've got these bolts almost all the way out, and now we're going to take the front bolt out. So this is also an 18, and before you start getting this too far out, you need to think about supporting the differential because it could fall out. I'm going to get my transmission jack here in a minute and get that underneath, but before that I'm going to get this crack loose and see if I can get this out without any special tools. Okay, well, see, that's what I mean. All right, now that it's supported, we can get this the rest of the way out. Okay, so now I've got it supported. I'm going to take the last two bolts out, and that should be all that holds it in, but it's not quite that simple. And we'll get that in a minute. So one of the things you're going to fight when you go to pull this down is getting the studs out of the drive shaft, or from the drive shaft out of the pinion flange. That is going to hang you up every single time. So the idea here is to take the weight off of the front of the diff and kind of tilt it back while supporting the front of it and sliding it back. There's not really enough room to get this all the way back without dropping it some, so you kind of have to go down and then back and then down and then back, all the while keep prying between the flange and the drive shaft. We're going to get started. We're going to get it down just a hair, and pull it back a little bit. So it will get stuck, and if you get too far, there's a point of almost no return where then you have to go back up. We're going to kind of pry on this. All right, we are out. The studs are out of that flange, and now we can come down. I can get that bolt out. It's gonna fall. That there. The key is to go down and back. See, now we're up against the back of the car, so we got to come down pretty far. And there's that pesky sway bar in the way, of course. You got to clear the back differential housing of the spare tire well. And then now we can guide the front of this down. And again, this is not like 30 pounds, so please be careful. And voila, she's out. Now that the diff is out of the way, we can see the front differential bushing, which we are going to be replacing. These are usually bad after 100,000 miles, or it depends on how they're driven and if they're a manual or auto. This has about 120K on it, and it has some play in it. As you can see, I can shake that pretty easily. Not a lot of force required to do that. And if you move it to the side, you can see it's cracked between the sleeve and the bushing. It's kind of separating, and when they get really bad, you'll definitely hear the noise when you load and unload the drivetrain. You can actually shear bolts off if this goes unchecked. You can break the bolt off in the differential. I've done that twice in my 540. So we're going to go ahead and replace this bushing. It's not a very expensive part. It does require some kind of special tooling to get this out, but it's stuff that you can usually make out of the magic bolt bins in your garage. So here's my hodgepodge of random crap from my garage that makes this job possible. I know there's a special tool for this. It's not very expensive, but I'm extra cheap today, so this is how we're going to do it. This is a long threaded bolt that I found. This is a collar and a sleeve that I kind of made from other parts of cars. There's a Toyota lug nut, and this is important. This is the receiving cup. This is actually from a ball joint press, and then here is the bushing. So the bushing sits like this in the car. This is the front of the car. This is the back of the car. So we want to drive this bushing out in the direction in which it was installed. So you can't just keep driving it through that direction. You have to push it back out. So to do that, we're going to push this up against here, which will, I know it'll push the sleeve first, but it'll eventually make contact with the outer sleeve. And then this will go on the outside of the subframe. And then this threads onto here. And as you tighten these two together, it's going to push this bushing out of the subframe and into this cup. And then to push it back on, we'll do the opposite. We don't really need the cup as much. We'll push it in from the front of the vehicle, flip this around here so we're not pushing on the center part of the sleeve. We don't want to do that. And then this doesn't even have to be there because this will get driven into the subframe as you tighten this bolt. I'll probably have to put a washer inside this cup. So one thing before we get started trying to push this out, is we have to pay attention to how the bushing is installed in the subframe. They're kind of indexed a certain way, and if you can see here, you see how these dots here, this is the front side of it, there's the back side of it. We got to make sure that we're installing it in the same direction. On a lot of bushings it doesn't matter. This one may not be, maybe one of those where it doesn't matter, but I'm going to make sure it goes in the same way it comes out. Alright, we're set up, so I'm going to use the impact. Here we go. Make sure that this receiving sleeve stays centered. Alright, so I ran out of threads. And, which means that we're going to add some washers to this. Let's see if I can show you what's going on here. So you can see that that piece I made is now in place of where the bushing is, and the bushing has been displaced out of the subframe. But we still have some more to go, so now we're going to add some washers so we can get some more depth on that bolt. And now it doesn't really matter where the collar is, that receiving cup, because the bushing is sticking about 3/4 the way out of the subframe. So let's hit it with the impact again. Alright, ran out of threads again. Let's get some more washers. So here you can see the bushing is being driven out of the subframe. We're going to get a few more washers. This bushing is only maybe, it looks like it's 2/3 the way out, so I don't need too much more space, and this thing will be out. So I've got another piece from that ball joint press kit as a spacer that needed quite a bit more, and this should be the final push. There we go. She's out. So you will be able to just pull this out on the other side. So here are our two bushings. This is our new one here on the left and the old one on the right. And if you look close, you see there's cracks around that center sleeve. And this one obviously is brand new, so it doesn't. So we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna get some spray lube in that area on the subframe so that this can slide right in. Let's get this driven home. Okay, so now we've buried that. Now we got to rearrange everything so there's room for that bush. All right, so we don't have very far to go. All right, I've got this set up to go back in. Let's see how we look now. It's a lot easier to go not far enough and then get it the rest of the way in than it is to get it too far in and then try to fish it back out without doing any damage. Looks like I go a hair more. Just a smidge. So let's get it just a little bit more in. I'm gonna use that large cup again. So I got it bumped back the rest of the way in, and it looks like it's in far enough. Again, you don't want to go too far. You rather take it apart a few times just to inspect and make sure that that bushing is not too far in. You just little by little is the best way to do it. Now we're gonna pull the back cover off this 315. Reseal the back cover and put new axle seals in it. Also, I have to swap out the axle stubs from the 325. Those are 325 axle stubs. Those are the M3 axle stubs. As you can see, they're not the same. And since I'm not changing axles in this car, I need to swap the stubs over. Okay, she looks pretty good in there. Yeah, it's not too bad. Pretty decent for a clutch type. So now we're going to do the axle seals. I've already done the other side. I do these all the same way. They're pretty easy. Take a punch, and you want to kind of push in the top of the seal. You want to push it in, not as, I wouldn't say as far as it'll go, but noticeably further in. Basically, what you're wanting to do is turn this thing sideways. So by pushing this in, and this works on all kinds of cars. And then you take your pry bar and sometimes it'll take a little bit of a thump with your hand, and there she goes. Now to put the new one in, I usually wipe this down, make sure it's clean. I'm using part of that ball joint press as a seal driver. They actually make seal drivers, but we're just gonna do it this way because it's already out and I don't really feel like digging for more tools. There's our new seal, and then the seal driver fits over the dust boot. The idea here is to get it as straight as possible, and we want to drive this into where it's flush like the old one was before we mess with it. We don't want to push it in too far. I'd say that's not ready. Almost there. That's pretty good. Alright, so now we're going to take the M3 stubs and pop them right back in. Then the last thing we're going to do on this is replace the pinion seal. And to do that, we need to take the pinion flange off. So what I do before I get that pinion flange off is I'll take a center punch and I'll mark the shaft and the nut. And by doing that, if I line the two marks up after I've taken it apart and reassembled it, I will know that it will be torqued at the exact same spot to the same amount, and I won't have to reset the backlash or anything like that. So I shouldn't have any differential issues. I know this is not the most precise way to do it. However, I've done this on several of these differentials, probably 20 or 30 of them actually, and I haven't had any issues. Yeah, it's a pretty good thing I'm doing this. This one looks pretty dry, and I would just hate to put this back together and have to pull it all back apart again. Get all the junk that might be in there, which shouldn't be. Take our new seal. So now I've got this threaded on. I've got a punch in here to hold it from turning, and then I'm just going to use this ratchet and the socket just to kind of bump it a little bit at a time until I get to where I need to go. Almost there. Precision. There we go. All right, ready to fill up and go back in the car. All right, so now we're gonna go back up, and we're gonna wanna pay attention to how the studs are on the drive shaft and kind of turn the input shaft to match that. That's gonna be the trickiest part of going back up, besides the fact that you have to physically tilt the diff up, get it up on the ledge of the subframe, and continuously walk it forward and up. Kind of a fight sometimes. Alright, here's where we gotta start paying attention to how that flange is. And you're gonna fight with that great location on the sway bar. But you wanna start getting everything lined up with the drive shaft. All right. Okay, so now I've got the drive shaft lined up. We're going to get bolts for the upper part of the back cover. Kind of get this into the subframe. Let's do the other side. Alright, now we want to get the front bolt in. So to get the front bolt in, take your pry bar and kind of adjust the height of the carrier with this. And I think we're in. Okay, so now we can get the train jack out of the way and reassemble. One thing that's pretty important before you go to push this up, make sure that this is hanging down and clear of this. It's easy to pinch these wires for the vehicle speed sensor, and it's also easy to forget about it and trap it above the differential, which then you gotta drop it back down again. So make sure that that's down and out of the way. So now we can go ahead and tighten up the bolts that hold the carrier into the subframe. And while we're in here thinking about it, we're gonna go ahead and plug in our vehicle speed sensor. So the next thing we need to do is get the driveshaft nuts on, the studs on the end of the driveshaft. So we're gonna thread them on by hand, and then we're going to tighten them up with a wrench. I like to do this before I do the axles, it's just habit. You could do either way, but I feel like this is easier. So now we got to start putting the axles in, at least bolting them in, and this is a little fun. It's a little challenging to get these just straight on here. Getting the flange level is the hardest part. And once you got one started, the other ones will go in pretty easily. And those aren't really tight yet. They're just snug. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the other side, and then we'll end up putting screwdrivers here to lock them up, and we'll tighten everything we can, rotate it, tighten everything we can, and we should be about done. So the last piece of this puzzle is to get the sway bar back into its spot, which is really pretty easy. Just kind of push up on it, and if you see there's a little tang on the bottom of this bracket, there's one on the other side as well. And it sits in a slot in the subframe. Make sure these are pointed in the right direction. And it will just fall into place. Make sure both sides are in before you start putting the bolts and stuff in. And then we'll get one side threaded. And we'll get the other side threaded. And then we'll cinch them down. So that went rather smooth. Nothing broke, nothing stripped. I didn't have to chase any threads. And anytime you get to say those three things after working on a 90s BMW, well, you did good. I was able to figure out what was wrong with the clutch pedal. It was stuck on the floor. Turns out the rubber line in the center of the hydraulic system for the clutch completely fell apart. It deteriorated completely, likely because I'm an idiot and I let this car sit for a couple years without moving it, and brake fluid has a tendency to do those kind of things. That's why you should never let these cars sit, ever. You're going to work on them whether you drive them, they're going to break that way, or they're going to break whether you let them sit, and it's a lot more fun to drive them and then work on them than just to work on them and let them sit. Don't forget to subscribe. We got some pretty cool stuff coming up right around the corner, and I'll talk to you guys later.